Well, good afternoon. My name is Jason Thacker. I serve as an Associate Research Fellow at the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, and I'm excited for our conversation. As you might have seen, our topic is on transhumanism, and if you're not sure what that is, that's okay. That's actually what we're going to be talking about today. I'm glad to be joined by these two gentlemen. Dr. Fazale Rana serves as the VP of Research and Apologetics at the Reasons to Believe, and he's also the co-author of a new book called Humans 2.0. It's actually for sale out in the lobby. And then joined by Peter Clarke, who is a legal editor, journalist, and author of the Singularity Survival Guide. And we have a good conversation in store. And so as we get going today, I'd want to start with you, Dr. Rana, and ask, kind of help us set the stage. What is transhumanism, and what is this kind of concept? How does it apply to technology and the modern uses?
You know, in my experience, a lot of people have not heard the term transhumanism, but they probably are familiar with some of the concepts of transhumanism if they have any interest in science fiction whatsoever. And in a nutshell, it's this intellectual and cultural movement that argues that we have a moral obligation to use science and technology to modify our biological makeups, to correct the flaws in our biology, to try to enhance or augment our capabilities beyond our natural biological limits, making ourselves more intelligent, psychologically well-adjusted, stronger. And this idea has always been a fringe idea that has moved in recent years into the academic mainstream and now is beginning to trickle down into the culture because of advances in biotechnology and bioengineering. And the ultimate objective, I think, for the transhumanist mindset or the transhumanist vision is to improve the human condition, alleviate pain and suffering, promote human flourishing, but also in some respects to try to attain a practical form of immortality. So it's a very interesting amalgam of science, technology, philosophy, and theology.
Yeah, and often when we talk about transhumanism, we think about it in light of modern emerging technologies. But Peter, you've argued in a lot of your writing that we've used technology as a society for generations and centuries. What are some of those uses of technology that we've already been embracing to kind of improve upon the human condition or aid us in our life?
Well, it's kind of interesting to think about the fact that the world is actually pretty hostile to human life. And the story of humanity is kind of the story of creating technologies to make the world more habitable for us. So everything from fire to the wheel, to shoes, to clothing, to shelter, all of these things are technologies that we just completely take for granted. And it wasn't that long ago where we stumbled upon some technologies, namely agriculture and some medical advances, where the human population just skyrocketed, where all of a sudden we had several billion people on the planet. And it's interesting to look at some of the technologies that led to that, or that, maybe I'll put it this way. You can look up right now technologies that have saved 1 billion lives. And they're very simple things often, like the toilet has saved over 1 billion lives. Blood transfusions, vaccines, a lot of just very what we consider like basic technologies have completely transformed human life and what we consider our society to be, and we still are just at the cusp of this, and so all the great revolutions in technology are just still kind of waiting to happen.
Yeah, and that kind of idea that we've always used technology, this isn't a new thing, but in light of a lot of the modern advances in computer science and technology, artificial intelligence, facial recognition, we're starting to see a lot of these new use cases. As earlier we said that technology can be used for good, but it can also be misused and abused to do evil things. As we're talking about transhumanism and kind of this new movement, Dr. Rana, you've written a really helpful book coming from a faith perspective, kind of evaluating the concept of transhumanism from a faith perspective and engaging some of the difficult questions that arise between this merger of faith and science. And so can you kind of expound on that? How does a Christian think about the concept of transhumanism? And then Peter, I want to have you to respond coming from the different perspective.
Yeah, well, you know, we're seeing in the last really decade just amazing advances, for example, in gene editing that give us the capacity to to treat genetic disorders for the first time, to maybe even cure or eliminate genetic disorders from the human gene pool, or advances in computer-brain interfaces that are going to revolutionize how we treat amputees or quadriplegic patients, where they can literally, with their thoughts, control, with these interfaces, computer software and hardware. So, for example, somebody who's an amputee can learn to control a robotic prosthetic limb with their thoughts, develop a sense of ownership. So this technology is continuing in the trend that Peter described, where it's going to literally improve the quality of people's lives. But this technology, again, can also be used to alter our very makeup as human beings. And so it raises a whole ensemble of ethical questions. And it also raises a lot of concerns about loss of human identity, loss of human dignity, questions about the misuse of the technology or unintended consequences that really could be summarized with this question, should we play God? And so the point of Humans 2.0 was to try to give a framework for Christians to understand what transhumanism is, understand the technology that undergirds it, and then at the same time, instead of ignoring the technology, acting as if it's not going to happen, or that it may never matriculate, or condemning it summarily because of our concerns, really the point of the book is how do we productively engage these kinds of advances, people that are advocating these advances in a way that builds bridges, that gives the Christian worldview a genuine opportunity to contribute to the decisions on how we utilize these technologies.
Thank you for that. And Peter, as you approach the concept of transhumanism, there is a lot of worldview implications, part of transhumanism, in terms of the theory of evolution, a lot of materialistic kind of worldview and understandings. Can you unpack some of that from us? I know you come from a unique perspective, a more secular perspective. How would you help us to understand kind of the undergirding, some of the worldview questions and foundations of transhumanism?
Right, so the transhumanist movement actually is a secular movement. So I guess a key difference here that is kind of, revolutionary, and people are still trying to figure this out as we go along, but the transhumanists and look at the human body fundamentally from a different perspective, where it's not like we're looking at it as a doctor trying to fix the human body as a sacred thing. It's more looking at the human body as an engineering project where we can fundamentally alter it. And so that is the main difference, is that the human body isn't considered sacred. Rather, what is considered sacred from a secular perspective is consciousness and sentience. And those are the values that a secularist coming from a purely materialistic background would still hold on to and value, is sentience as the highest value.
Yeah, and that's really helpful. As we talk about transhumanism, there's often a debate over human exceptionalism, this idea that as Christians we come to it as that we're created in God's image, there's a uniqueness. Peter, I know you have written about the difference between degree and kind and a lot of those type of things. Dr. Rana, help us to think about from a theological perspective. Is human exceptionalism necessary? Is that something that's foundational to our faith? Or is it something that, in light of a lot of the transhumanist thought, that we can kind of get rid of and say there really isn't anything unique about humanity and that's okay?
Yeah, well, this idea of human exceptionalism, which you could think of as being, in a sense, a scientific concept, I think aligns and intersects with the concept of the image of God that we see in Scripture. And the image of God is not a throwaway concept in Christian theology. It is central ultimately to the gospel, because the idea is that as human beings we are made in God's image, we are the crown of creation, we stand apart from all other creatures, and that because of the image of God we can uniquely enter into a relationship with our Creator through the person of Christ. But also the image of God is foundational to Christian ethics. It's because everybody bears God's image, every human life has infinite worth and value. So it's a very, very critical concept in Christian theology. And while a majority of anthropologists would argue that we really differ only in degree, not kind, from other creatures, and therefore argue that science really undermines the image of God in human exceptionalism, in recent years there's kind of a resurgence of a minority of anthropologists that are arguing on the basis of the evidence that really human beings actually do stand apart from other creatures, that we are qualitatively distinct. And what seems to make us distinct are these qualities that you could understand as being qualities that, in a sense, are a manifestation of the image of God. So we're at a point in time where we can make a scientific case for the credibility of human exceptionalism and the image of God.
And Peter, you come from a slightly different perspective when in terms of human exceptionalism. When we talk about transhumanism, you have written that it's an existential threat to human exceptionalism, and that's a concept that's fundamentally flawed and that we should get rid of. Can you expand on that and say, why do you think the concept of human exceptionalism is flawed?
Right, so the concept of human exceptionalism really is unique to the West. And it is a concept that does, as far as I can tell, originate from the scriptural idea that we're created in the image of God. And this still does, I think, for all people in the West, secularists included, it does have a kind of a poetic truth to it, that it's kind of poetically true. But the scientific community has completely moved past this idea that we are, as humans, fundamentally different in kind from all other animals. And so the argument goes like this, that we are the same as animals, but just we're different in degree. And some examples of this would be, we have the same DNA as animals, essentially, or very similar DNA. We have same cell structure. We have the same neurons, essentially. If we were to, so we can do studies on rats for new lipstick products or new everything from lipstick to cocaine to name a drug, and we've done testing on rats for these things. And the reason why these tests aren't absurd, why they make sense, is because we're fundamentally the same even as rats, and they're very low on the totem pole of intelligence, but we're so similar to them that these studies aren't absurd. If you were to say, we could very easily come up with a case of how we are fundamentally different in kind from all other creatures, and it would be that if we were made out of silicon and steel, we would be different in kind. But that's not the case. We're carbon-based creatures with cells that look like all other creatures on life. Very quickly, I'll describe how I think that this is important in the transhumanist debate, is that I guess I have touched on this a little bit already, but transhumanists and secularists view the human body not as a sacred temple that we will never move past, but as, it's kind of in jest referred to as a meat suit that we do need to move past. And that's not a bad thing, because the important moral value for a transhumanist isn't the meat suit, it's the consciousness and the sentience. And the caveat with all of this is no one knows what consciousness is yet. So this is still the magic in the machine that we're still trying to figure out. And this is why it's still a very fascinating debate to have.
Yeah, and along with these foundational kind of understandings of transhumanism, Dr. Rana, I want to ask you, what are some of these emerging technologies that we're seeing kind of improving upon the human condition? And then in your book, you point out that ironically, a lot of these technologies actually prove the existence of human exceptionalism. Can you expand on that as well?
Yeah. Well, in terms of the technologies, one that I'll focus on that I think has probably the most immediate bearing on what we're talking about here are computer-brain interfaces, which I briefly mentioned, because again, these are interfaces that have been developed that can detect electrical activity in the brain of patients, and the patients can learn to control the brain electrical activity through their thoughts, and then send electrical transmissions to computer hardware and computer software, and learn to control these devices with their thoughts. And so this is really exciting, as I mentioned, for things like treating quadriplegics, amputees, people that are locked in. But it also can do some interesting things, creating something known as the brain net, where you can begin to affect activity in remote locations with your thoughts, where you can divorce the effect of your actions from your physical location, or potentially you can begin to tether brains together. And so this is really, again, something that I think to me concerning in terms of loss of human identity and things like that. But to me, when it comes to this question of human exceptionalism, I would count actually the conception of the transhumanist vision as being part of that evidence that we are exceptional, because there's no other creature that exists today or has ever existed, including creatures like Neanderthals, that have ever had the wherewithal to even conceive of the idea of altering their own biological makeup, taking control of their own evolution, trying to usher in a post, whatever that particular species might be, a post-species age of sorts. And it's in this capacity for envisioning the transhumanist future stems from our ability called symbolism, where we can represent the world with symbols and communicate those symbols to one another through language and music and art. But incumbent in that is the ability to manipulate those symbols in a near infinite number of ways. And this allows us to reflect on the past, to anticipate the future. It allows us to problem solve. It's the basis for doing science, for developing technology. And so what makes the transhumanist vision even possible is something that's distinct and unique about us. And it's, again, these particular set of qualities. And as a Christian, I see those as essentially connected to the image of God, that they align with the image of God. So I think, ironically, transhumanism actually supports human exceptionalism, not challenges or undermines it.
And a lot of the transhumanist kind of viewpoints or understandings of the world, there's a lot of really good uses of technology. I mean, throughout human history, even my glasses themselves are a form of technology. But recently, my father he had an amputation of his leg, and he has a prosthetic. And I was joking with him in the hospital as he was recovering that maybe you could get one of those robotic legs, being able to restore his ability to get around and to move. And so when we look at transhumanism and hearing us talk here, I see a distinction between the restoration of the body, restoring something that was already there, the ability to move, or with my eyes are denigrated, I'm not able to see like I could normally, the effects of sin from a Christian worldview. Is there a distinction between restoring the use of using technology to restore our bodies with the flaws of sin and the brokenness, versus upgrading our bodies, the idea of becoming like a superhuman in the sense of that brain control interface where we're able to connect to the internet or pull all this information in? Is there a distinction between restorative use and kind of upgrading technology? And this is for both of you.
Maybe I'll start, and I'm gonna take the position that at least right now, for the technology that we have right this moment in time, I'm gonna say kind of no. I'm leaning towards no, and for the reason that if we are talking about improving human health, right? And this is something that we're all trying to do at some level, eating healthy or going to the doctor to cure a disease. It's a very simple thing, but at the same time, if you carry that to its extreme, the consequence of that is more longevity. And Aubrey de Grey talks about this a lot, and he's working with his company is specifically focused on essentially eternal life. But he will never say that, and he'll never call it that because it just sounds kind of absurd. So instead, he says that we're working on fixing the problems at hand, and it just happens to be the case that as a result, you might live to 200 or 300 or 400 years. But it's not because they're trying to do that. That just is a natural result of all of the steps that they're taking along the way. And I think that argument or that perspective applies to anything else that's happening today in the world of longevity research or augmenting our bodies in other capacities.
Yeah, I mean, this idea of, using this technology, again, to improve the quality of people's lives, I think as a Christian, I see this is an incredibly good use of the technology. And the complexity, of course, is that the very technology that we really want to see developed, again, to treat genetic disorders, to treat, again, patients that are suffering from these horrific diseases and injuries, is also that same technology that can be employed for human enhancements and even again, in pursuit of the transhumanist vision. And so I think both Peter and I would fully agree that in terms of restorative use, this is a really high value. But the line between restoration and enhancement is really blurred, in my opinion. Because let's say you could hypothetically develop a genetic treatment where you could modify human beings so that you would no longer be susceptible to a particular pathogen that's in the environment. Well, is that a biomedical use? Is that an enhancement? I think we all would say that that's probably not a bad thing to pursue biomedically, because you're going to minimize, again, disease. So to me, it's a very blurred line. And if you think about it, as you are already pointing out, we use technology already to augment our capabilities beyond our biological limits. What I think is eerie maybe about human enhancements is that we're now actually altering our biological makeup. And that can, I think, create an ick factor that can make people uncomfortable. I understand that. But I'm not completely sure that some limited enhancements aren't necessarily good things, aren't necessarily just an extension of technology development. So this is a very complex question. It's messy. Things are not clearly delineated, which is what's frightening, but which is also what is very interesting and engaging about this as well, and why, as Christians, we really need to be prepared, I think, to engage these ideas well.
Yeah, and that's part of why we're gathered here and having this conversation, is to engage in dialogue with one another, to be thinking about these heady concepts, because we're under no impression we're going to solve all of the problems of transhumanism or human existence or sin, even on this stage. But Peter, you pointed out earlier, a lot of the transhumanists kind of thought that the telos, the end goal, is this kind of overcoming our natural limitations, and part of that limitation is death. Mm-hmm. There's a popular author, you all know Harari, in his book Homo Deus, where he talks about this idea that we can overcome death. Is that something that, in your perspective, that we should pursue? Is that a good use of technology, a good use of human creativity and ingenuity? And is that kind of our future hope, kind of this longevity? Is that the goal in life, is to live longer, or is there something greater?
So I'll talk first from the stereotypical transhumanist perspective, which this movement, and kind of one of the main reasons why we're even here talking about it today, is because of this guy Zoltan Istvan, who popularized this movement hugely in 2016 when he ran for president after creating the transhumanist political party. And his specific goal was to not die. He is very anti-death. And so there is definitely a part of this movement that is just absolutely laser focused on, I'm not going to die, and we're going to overcome death, and aging is a disease, and all of these things, that this is the main focus. A little bit more from a practical perspective, I would say that the only way that we would actually overcome death is if we did, at some level, merge with machines, and the concept is uploading our minds to the cloud. And this is so far-fetched at this point in time that it literally still is science fiction. It's great science fiction. I don't know if anybody saw the Black Mirror episode, the Christmas one, where you were able to create a digital copy of yourself, and then that digital copy, who is you can digitally alter time so that 1 second in real time is like an eternity in digital time. So you could essentially live forever with your digital copy or your mind-uploaded copy of yourself. Just by even if there is no such thing as eternity, you could manufacture that in a digital space. But again, this is completely science fiction. So until we are in a world where that's even conceivably possible, which this is still very far away if it's possible at all, it still is practically a matter of the Aubrey de Grey method of trying to fix the problems with our bodies so that we delay death as long as possible. And I think that's a good cause.
And Dr. Rana, I want to pose a similar question to you. Is coming from a Christian perspective, we know that death is the great equalizer, but also the great enemy. But we also believe in a Savior who has overcome death. And so that's where a lot of our hope. How do you engage what Peter's saying, kind of in this idea where a lot of transhumanists have this innate desire to avoid death or to extend our lives as long as possible? There's kind of this fear almost of death. How do Christians respond to that line of thought?
Well, one of the things that I find fascinating is the fact that I think transhumanism is really exposing the very point that you're raising, is that we all, as human beings, somehow see death as unnatural, right, as being the enemy to conquer. We somehow see it tragic to think about the fact that the human species may cease to exist. That we all have this sense that there's an inherent in us, that there is purpose and destiny, not only for us as individuals, but again, for the human species. And so what transhumanism is doing is exposing that need that we all have. And I don't really have an issue with transhumanism as such, other than to say that I think that transhumanists are to some degree naive, if I may say that, in this sense, because what they're doing is they're looking for salvation of sorts, and that salvation is in technology. And we know from experience that technology can be used for an enormous amount of good, but there's always unintended consequences with any technology. And the more powerful a technology, the more concerning the unintended consequences may be. We also, as Christians, recognize that human beings are sinful, and that we have this incredible capacity as human beings, sadly, to take even the best things and use them or misuse them for the most horrific evil. And so to think that technology is somehow going to save us or create a utopia or grant us, immortality is, I think, really naive. And in my opinion, the only way we ever are going to have genuine eternal life is through the person of Christ. But to me, this is a place where I think we can have a very interesting conversation with our culture that's going to be influenced by this idea of transhumanism. That instead of, again, condemning or ignoring, I think we have an opportunity to engage. And it's just remarkable to me that the gospel can be relevant even in a transhumanist context, that the gospel has relevancy.
Yeah, and a lot of the spaces that I engage in, as we're approaching a lot of these conversations as a culture, as we're kind of all having a seat at the table, a lot of the questions that we're debating end up being kind of moral and ethical questions. And so, Peter, I want to ask you, coming from a transhumanist perspective, a purely secular perspective, what is the foundation for a transhumanist ethic? This idea of how we interact with one another, social interactions, but distinguish between right and wrong, if everything boils down to this kind of materialistic, we come from the muck and we're just evolving. Where does their sense of morality come from, or ethics?
Really good question. And speaking personally, but also I think for the transhumanist movement in general, when you come from a secular perspective, I really advocate for having a consequentialist view with these things. So that's the idea that if you have an action, you're going to judge its moral worth based on the consequences. And in a world where you don't want to move towards having more needless suffering, instead you want to move towards human flourishing. And so any moral choice is navigating this space where you're looking at the consequences of trying to navigate towards more human well-being and away from needless suffering. An example of this was last year. There was a scientist in China who kind of went rogue, and he injected some fetuses with genetic engineering so that they would never develop HIV, allegedly. But he was roundly criticized, and I think he was fired and maybe jailed even for this, even in China, because they didn't know the consequences of this. I mean, it was a reckless action where he was like, oh yeah, great thing, I don't want these babies to ever have HIV, great cause. But at the same time, it was untested, it was like completely reckless, and a transhumanist or a consequentialist would say that was the morally not right thing to do because you didn't know what the consequences of that would be. And so we need to move, I think, cautiously through this space.
Yeah, and that's a really helpful point to bring out. Dr. Rana, as you're talking, our Christian faith informs our ethics. I mean, it often is the foundation for our ethics as believers. Can you expand on how a Christian would approach kind of what is our ethical foundation? How do we distinguish right and wrong? in light of a lot of these kind of existential and moral questions that we're facing with technology.
Yeah. Well, as you're pointing out, I mean, the ethical questions are just legion when it comes to even the biomedical application of some of these technologies. And then when we start talking about enhancements or the transhumanist, vision, these ethical issues amplify and intensify. And I've heard some bioethicists even say that they're not even sure that we have an ethical framework in place, at least from a secular standpoint, that can properly navigate these questions. And so they're calling upon a new ethical system. And I actually think that the Christian worldview, which is based on an ancient ethical system, has a lot to contribute remarkably to how we could use emerging biotechnologies. And it's because of the image of God concept. Because of the image of God, every human being has infinite worth and value, which means we want to pursue technologies that minimize pain and suffering, promote human flourishing. But we also recognize that we don't ever want to exploit human beings in the process. We want to always be cognizant of the marginalized. We want to make sure there's fair and equitable access to the technology. And because of the image of God, too, we have been granted responsibilities in the creation to be caretakers of the creation, to subdue the creation, and bring it under our control, to use the creation for the benefit of humanity. And this is a very strong motivator for science and for technology. So what we see with the Christian worldview is a worldview that would actually promote the same technology development that a transhumanist would like, but would recognize that there are boundaries or parameters around which we should never transcend. So I think the Christian worldview has a lot to contribute to the dialogue about how this technology should be used. And it seems to me to be an inherently more robust ethic, if I may say, than something like consequentialism.
And there are a number of kind of ethical frameworks or guidelines that we're seeing in culture, from the European Union putting forth kind of principles for trustworthy AI, to Google itself releasing its own AI principles in light of some kind of thorny ethical debates over weapon technology. And even people of faith coming together. Even I was telling you earlier, my organization helped kind of spearhead an evangelical statement of principles on artificial intelligence. So we see a lot of these kind of documents being produced, kind of the culture looking for guidelines and frameworks. And so, Peter, I want to ask you, with even in the transhumanist movement, you have this idea or this concept or document put together, the Transhumanist Bill of Rights. Mm-hmm. What is that, and what are some of the popular organizations that many of us may be familiar with or maybe not familiar with that are promoting transhumanism in our culture?
Sure, so I'll talk about the Transhumanist Bill of Rights first. And this is one of the interesting things about the transhumanist movement, is that it's all a little gimmicky and it's a little kind of silly. So this document, it was created by Zoltan Isvan, who is a great guy. He's kind of a friend of mine, and he's one of the leaders of this movement. But he created this document when he ran for president and with his transhumanist political party, which wasn't even a real party at the time, but he called it one and got media attention for it. So, I mean, this movement it's a weird social movement, and it's got some gimmicky components to it. This happens to be one. But the interesting thing about this document, the Transhumanist Bill of Rights, is that it sets up a moral and legal framework for all sentient creatures, not just for human life, but for life forms including cyborgs and sentient creatures that may exist in just digital spaces. So things that don't exist yet, which is actually kind of an interesting thing that, like, what if we do, what if you turn on your computer tomorrow and it has some upgrade and it is sentient? I mean, do we give that moral worth? Well, we should. Even though it's not human, we should give them moral value. Science fiction again, but it could be a real question in the future. But as to a couple companies that are working on this, you can almost name a tech company, and they have some arm that's at some level working in the transhumanist space. So Google, no one knows this, but they have a company called Calico, and it's specifically just working on longevity research and solving some of these problems in the world of, let's call, aging a disease. There's also Elon Musk company Neuralink, trying to connect our brains to the cloud. There is Rick Kurzweil has the Singularity University, which is doing a lot of work And also, Aubrey de Grey is the other big one with his SINS Foundation Research Foundation, and that's specifically trying to also work on this longevity process. Those are the big ones, and I mean, there are a ton too. You could just throw a rock in Silicon Valley, and you'll hit some company that's at some level working on a transhumanist project.
Yeah, and this conversation's been thrilling so far. This is going to be our last question. It's for both of you. For some of us, this is the first time we've ever even heard this word. Some of us might be confused or have some kind of tangential understanding of transhumanism or technology and be interested in it. What are some resources or some guidelines, some things that maybe we should pursue to learn more, to maybe even have conversations like this moving forward? What are some resources that you would recommend for us to engage this debate?
Well, at the risk of shameless self-promotion, I did write a book called Humans 2.0 with my friend Ken Samples, who's a philosopher, and we actually are giving away copies. So if you, when you exit the auditorium, if you go, there's a table out there, you could pick up a copy of the book. And the goal of the book, again, was to introduce people to what transhumanism is, to give them an understanding of some of the technology, and then, again, to produce a framework for Christians to begin to help think through this issue in a productive way. But there's another great book that I would recommend by, it's edited by, if you want a more scholarly treatment, by Ronald Cole Turner, and it's called Transcendence and Transhumanism, and it's a collection of essays written by Christian scholars from a wide range of theological perspectives, some conservative, some more liberal, that gives you, again, just an interesting range of views from a Christian worldview perspective on transhumanism and again, how to engage. So those are two works that I would recommend.
Peter?
I'll recommend two resources. The first is called Letter to Mother Nature by Max Moore, and it's a very short essay. You can read it right now on your phone in like 2 minutes, and it's one of the documents that kicked off the transhumanist movement, and it's fascinating because you can read this in 2 minutes, and even if you completely do not agree with this movement at all, it will make you think. It'll get you thinking about, like, oh, okay, I see what's going on here. Max Moore is the guy who founded Alcor, which is the company, I believe they're in Arizona, where if you want to live forever, you can have your brain frozen, cryogenically frozen, so that then when you can live forever, you will be thawed out, and they will put you in a new body. So he has a company that literally does this. But A Letter to Mother Nature by Max Moore is definitely worth reading, and it's so short. You can read it in a minute and a half. One other resource that I would recommend is a Netflix documentary in 4 parts called Unnatural Selection. Highly entertaining, and it touches all these topics. And it has the stories that are the personal stories. We were rooting for the guy, and then it deals with the ethical dilemmas with a lot of this research. So, Unnatural Selection on Netflix. I would definitely recommend that too.
Well, as we conclude our time together, I just want to say thank you. Thank you for this thrilling conversation, but also I do encourage you, as believers, we can engage these secular ideas from a gospel perspective and a gospel worldview and pick up secular and more Christian kind of resources. We can engage these things and reading them through a gospel lens. Would you join me in thanking these gentlemen for this thrilling panel discussion?